Hey everyone, we wanted to put a quick disclaimer before we get into today's show. In this episode, there are some quotes from old newspapers which use racist and offensive language. We left these words in at times where we felt it's important to understand specifically what the writers were intending. Where we can, we then switch back to modernized terminology. Thanks as always. Hope you enjoy the episode. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of The Ghost Furnace. I am Bond, and I'm here as always with my cohort Nick Pennsylvania. How you doing, Nick?
I am in recovery from last weekend's festivities and enjoying myself.
Excellent, man.
I'm polka'd out for the year.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But for tonight, we're not going to talk about polka very much, but we are going to be talking about Western Maryland folklore with our new friend, Susan Fair. How you doing, Susan?
I'm doing great, and I'm so excited to be here with y'all.
We are super excited to have you. I kind of want to tell the serendipitous story real quick of why we're having this conversation. Me and you have been talking a little bit on like Instagram and everything, just about, the show and the work you do that we're going to get into here. As folks have probably heard, we always have a backlog of stuff that we're working on and looking into, and sometimes things just kind of line up. And what happened recently is me and Nick were corresponding with one of our other friends and listeners about folklore, and they were talking about Maryland folklore specifically and about how we should cover some of it. And I was like, funny you should say that. I know exactly who I need to ask about that. So that's when I reached out to you, and you graciously accepted to come speak with all of us tonight.
My pleasure. I'm so excited. I really appreciate that, what you guys do and how you take such a measured look at things, and how you're not ready to just discount things, but you don't just buy right into things either.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's very kind of you to say, and we do try and take that kind of like middle of the road approach as much as we can, despite how excited or frustrated we get about certain stories.
Yep. I hear you.
But so before we get into the Maryland, kind of some of this Maryland folklore, do you mind telling everyone kind of a little bit about yourself, like how you got into researching these topics and how you engage with them?
Yes. Well, I worked for public libraries for many, many years. And in 2010, I moved out to Western Maryland, to Washington County, when I got married. And my husband at the time was working for the National Park Service. And I was very excited when I moved out here because there's just so much history. And I really like Civil War history, and I like the state parks and the national parks in the area. I've always been super interested in folklore and ghosts and all that kind of stuff. And over the years, I'd written for local magazines, regional magazines, and some local newspapers. And I've done some writing for, back in the day, Cryptomundo, for Lauren Coleman and that sort of thing. But when I started getting so excited about the history out here and working at a local museum at the time, and helping an older gentleman with his collection, I started to engage a lot more with the history and some of the folklore of the region. And I started working on a book for History Press, Mysteries and Lore of Western Maryland. So then I started kind of researching the stories more in earnest. And ever since then, of course, I just kind of do deeper dives into what I originally learned and try to add to my knowledge of the folklore of Western Maryland, which is Western Maryland, by the way, the region is usually considered to be Frederick County, Washington County, Allegheny County, and Garrett County, Maryland. And some people would dispute the Frederick part because it's not Western enough, but for our purposes, Frederick is also part of Western Maryland.
I mean,
It's sort of the
that's
mountain
only a few
area.
counties, so
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's fair. I think it's fair.
Well, I feel like anytime you're talking about like regional stuff like this, when you're looking at the edges, people always like no one ever agrees on that stuff. So
Mhm.
that is not
That's true.
surprising.
For
And
sure, for sure.
I think everybody, no matter where you're at, can probably relate to that that
Mhm.
issue. But
Yeah.
so it sounds like you have a lot of experience looking into different elements of folklore and looking
Mhm.
up stories and everything. And I imagine like as a librarian, I am lucky enough to have a few people I call friends that are librarians. Like that probably is a very interesting spot to occupy because you're kind of like in the thick of it with all this information and how things flow around communities, and especially working at like smaller libraries and working on collections and curation. I imagine like you're really seeing the minutia of a lot of stuff. So how does being a librarian, I'm wondering, like affect how you approached all this stuff later on?
Well, librarians I used to work at Carroll County Public Libraries, mostly, and originally Frederick County Public Libraries. But in Carroll County, I actually, the librarians there would want you to know that I am not a librarian.
Oh.
I actually worked in, it's what's called the Materials Management Department. And I assisted a librarian who ordered the non-print item materials mostly. And back in the day when I worked for Frederick County Public Libraries, I actually worked in the audiovisual department, if that tells you how old I am. Audiovisual department. So, but I have done programs
Mhm.
for public libraries, and especially working at the museum and with the collection. And this is in Boonesboro. It was like a whole different way of like interacting with the history because people would come in all the time wanting to find out things about their families or about certain aspects of history, and that sort of helped me, you know, push me to learn more about, this area and folklore and kind of how it connects to local families and that sort of thing.
No, that's so cool because I just always think that anytime you have someone who has that sort of like professional perspective on these things,
Hmm.
um, it just adds it's just a different way of looking at how some of this stuff can grow over time,
Hmm.
and also how quickly things can change with just one thing that is out of place or not filed properly or
Exactly.
it's so like, almost like how touchy some of it can be. So that's just I don't know. I had to ask about that because I think that's such an interesting element
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
how these things kind of get built. So you mentioned that in Western Maryland there is you have a lot of history out there. And there is a lot going on in the area, and I can imagine how excited you were to be kind of relocating out there. Um,
Yeah.
Now, as far as like the actual folklore goes, what was the first like either like story or first kind of legend or cryptid or ghost or whatever that you kind of discovered in the area that really kind of grabbed your attention and thought like, oh, here's something special that I can really kind of get into?
Well, in Boonesboro, just outside of Boonesboro, there is actually a wayside marker, and an actual cryptid has a panel on this wayside marker. And the wayside marker is for the National Road. It goes through Baltimore and Frederick, Hagerstown, Cumberland, and then further west. It was started like in the like 1840, early 1800s,
Okay.
and may have originally been like Indian trails that sort of kind of segued into roads that became, more and more, paved, and more towns growing along these roads, popping up. The story of the Snarly Owl is related to there's a place called South Mountain House, and it was a large inn slash tavern that was from somewhere in the like maybe 1740s originally. In the 1880s, it was purchased by a widow from Washington, D.C., Madeline Vinton Dahlgren. She made it like her summer home. Her late husband was Admiral Dahlgren of Civil War fame. He invented like a important gun that was used on ships or in the Navy in the Civil War. So she moved out there and she took a real big interest in all the local legends and ghost stories that she would hear from what she called the poor mountain folk. Some of whom, of course, came to work for her.
I was about to say, yeah.
Yeah. And she actually wrote a book. She actually collected these stories and turned it into a book called South Mountain Magic. And that's where a whole lot of the knowledge of our local legends and lore comes from. And that's where the Snarly Owl, who now has his own spot on a wayside marker, and that's actually been there, I don't know how long, but for quite a while. And the Snarly Owl was like a kind of a ghost dog. And he would block the road sometimes when folks were traveling. Sometimes he looked kind of wolf-like. The actual image of him on the wayside marker, the drawing, he looks kind of like a little bit of a mangy, thin, werewolfy slash wolf kind of dog.
Right, yeah.
I don't think it does him justice. But he would like loom up and block the road. People would think that they could pass through him, but then they couldn't. One of the local men told Madeline Dahlgren, she described him as a sturdy kind of mountain man, that he tried to fight the Snarly Owl, and his blows just went right through the beast.
Wow.
Yeah, so obviously I was like super thrilled when I realized that I lived in an area that actually has, like a quote unquote cryptid on a wayside marker.
Right, which isn't terribly common. I mean,
It's definitely not. It should be more common.
Yeah, I mean, like it's like there are places that like definitely embrace those things.
Mm-hmm.
But that's definitely the exception rather than the rule. And to hear that they've had this there for a while on a wayside marker, I mean, that says something about the area and how they at least respect the story,
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and there are a lot of kind of Snarly Owl adjacent stories, kind of black. The kind of typical black dog stories, ghost dog. There's supposed to be a spot where, of course, this is, the legend like in the 1800s, if you crouch down to drink out of a certain creek at a certain spot, you might look over and see that this phantom dog has joined you and is also drinking, alongside you.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So there are some nice ones. They're not all scary.
Right. I was about to say, well, that's really interesting. So, like, I mean, one, just the idea of a phantom dog drinking, from that almost seems like communal in a way, and kind of inviting. You don't hear that very often.
No. I mean, I have heard cool stories of phantom dogs being like friendly and
right,
kind of companionable.
Well, I think it was Nick, wasn't it? W.T. Watson, when we interviewed him, he did a book on black dogs, and he mentioned there was a few where they like would lead people and
Hmm.
stuff like that.
Ah.
I
Hmm.
think.
Yeah, and one of the curious things I think of Black Dog stories, because there are quite a few, is that they all seem that they're fairly spread out, but they all
Hmm.
seem to take place in the more rural settings.
Hmm.
Um, Unlike hellhounds, which I think there's in folklore, there's a fine line one has to parse between, is this a black dog story or is this a hellhound story?
Uh-huh. Hmm.
Right.
And I haven't quite been able to taxonomize which is which, but
Yeah.
I kind of listening to some of that, I was reminded of a story that we had talked about some time ago in nearby West Virginia, the county immediately north of Hagerstown, which Washington County,
Right.
where Berkeley Springs is
Hmm.
at, if
Hmm.
I'm remembering correctly. So I wonder if this is a shared cryptid sort of thing, but I'll have to go back and look into that
Hmm.
because obviously these things don't adhere to state or county
Right.
lines.
They
Oh,
don't.
yeah, definitely not. Or countries, or I mean,
Yeah.
that it seems to be one of the most common. I think types of stories and folklore are the black dog. So.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and it's interesting. Now, with like the snarly owl, like one that's also like a very unique name, and I think that it's cool that it has like a specific name. It's not just like random black dog.
Hmm.
It's like
Hmm.
nope. This is the capital the snarly owl.
Right.
Is there
Let's not
any
confuse it with any other.
right? Yeah,
That's
but
right.
so
Hmm.
is there any history or was and I do want to ask about this Madeline Dahlgren as well too, but
Hmm.
'cause she seems like a fascinating character. But with the Snarly Yow, was there any reference before she got involved, or is there any like provenance to that throughout history? Do we know like where that story came from before her or anything?
Well, I did do some research on the name,
Mm-hmm.
and the only thing I did find is that there is a book written in like the 1840s called The Snarly Owl. And the
Okay.
Snarly Owl, I can't think of the name of the author, but I think it's sort of French. But the book was about a sort of hard scrabble, hard luck dog who was kind of,
Really?
yes, he was kind of a seagoing dog, and he had all kinds of adventures where he'd be kidnapped and have to fight his way out of all kinds of situations. And yeah, so that I assume that's where the name came from, but I don't
Yeah.
know where the author of that book,
Got that
yeah,
necessarily. If it was made out of
right.
whole cloth or
I
Hmm.
would think that the name Snarly Owl would be, it's a beast. It's
Hmm.
snarly. It yowls.
yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah.
It makes its own name in that way.
That's what I think. That's what I
Yeah,
think.
no, I
Hmm.
think that, no, that makes sense. But that story you're talking about that actually sounds like a fun book. So I
Hmm.
might need to look for that. Like that sounds
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Yeah.
like
What
like
was the that Belgian one with the dog Snowy? Tintin.
oh
It's kind of like an
Tintin.
older version of Tintin. It sounds
Hmm.
Yeah.
like.
Hmm.
Well, and it's interesting you found that book you said you believe was in the 1840s whenever
Hmm.
Madeline Dahlgren was doing this in what the 1880s.
Right.
So like that name to us is obviously a very foreign, unique name, but that's an interesting element that there could have been like a pop culture element where she was referencing something that
Hmm.
other people at the time would have had some kind of correlation to. I'm like, oh yeah,
Right.
it's a snarly yowl.
Hmm.
What else
Hmm.
would it be? Of course, it's a snarly yowl.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure she was quite well read.
Right.
According to her, the local, folks on the mountain
Hmm.
were not, according
Well,
to her. She
yeah.
was a
Well,
little
and
bit of
it's
a snob.
right. Well, and we've run into that talking about a lot of the original folklorists here in Pennsylvania and other places, and again, not unique to any state lines or county lines anywhere. There's this. You have these people who are doing what we now realize is really important cultural work, kind of compiling and promoting these stories,
Hmm.
but also they're doing so in a way that is maybe culturally disruptive or insensitive or
Hmm. Hmm.
they really they usually are pretty complicated characters, and it sounded like this Madeline Dahlgren is probably very, very much in that same line. Is she someone who is looked at? This is probably a question for our friend Tim Grieve Carlson, but looked at is she looked at as like an early folklorist of the time in any academic way, or is it just like a pop culture kind of thing?
I think I don't think she has been looked at as a folklorist.
Okay.
I think she had done writing before doing this book. I think she had a lot of opinions on things. I think she was kind of old-fashioned in some ways. She was kind of I think kind of an anti-suffragette.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
I think, that she was definitely well read and, intelligent. She didn't, have a lot of respect for the where the stories
were coming from in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think she really liked that kind of stuff, but she was definitely very Catholic. She actually had her own chapel built across the road from yes, and it's still there to this day. It's very cool looking.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah, but she in the book she referred to the lunatics of South Mountain.
Oh, geez.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah,
that sort of thing. And she mentioned kind of like devil worship, because there is like some Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic practiced. There was a local wizard who was, the practitioner, of the local, folk healing and stuff.
Oh no, I was going to say I just find that especially interesting because, of course, having dove deep into that and we've interviewed Robert Phoenix before, who is a very, very visible practitioner of the Brauchery, the Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic. That, I mean, the tome on that is the Verbegon Front, which it's a German Catholic sort of folk practice. So I don't know if
there's a lot of overlap.
Right. I don't know if there was a strong anti-papist sentiment with this woman, but yeah.
Interesting people. Yeah, it's just people are not as one-dimensional as you might think sometimes.
Yeah, she definitely relished these kind of stories. You could tell. I mean, and she told ghost stories associated with her house, with South Mountain House. That happened to people that stayed with her and stuff. So she definitely you could tell she was harboring some beliefs in this kind of ghost stories, and definitely enjoyed these stories.
That's interesting. That's wild. Okay, so there's a lot going on here already.
For sure.
So we've kind of established this place has a rich history of both folklore and people documenting the folklore, which is good for us, hundreds of years later.
Sure.
So that was the first kind of story you said, the Snarly Owl, that kind of got you into looking into this stuff seriously in the area, at least locally. What were some of the other things that you kind of got into once you started going down the Snarly Owl road?
Well, probably the most well-known story from this area is the Snallygaster. And the Snallygaster.
Fantastic name.
Yeah, great.
Yes,
yeah,
it
great
is.
Names. Great names.
It is definitely a great name. Learn about the Snallygaster. We will go back to 1909, and Middletown is a little town along the National Road in Frederick County. It's actually close to Boonesboro. It's just a few miles kind of down the mountain. So it's kind of close to Washington County too. There was a newspaper called the Middletown Valley Register. And on February 12th, 1909, the people picking up the Middletown Valley Register learned that there was a very, very large flying monster being seen in the region, according to this newspaper. And this monster was described in the newspaper as having very large wings, kind of a very long pointed bill, a screech like a locomotive, and one eye in the middle of its forehead.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a very unique sounding creature.
Well, and I think the most unique aspect about it is it's a cyclops.
I
Because I think
know.
all the other things, you would never have a winged monster that wouldn't have a substantial wingspan. Like you wouldn't see a hummingbird size thing and be like, that thing is a monster.
Right,
Yeah.
But I
right.
still think that it's having one centrally located eye is especially peculiar.
It is. It is. Definitely.
Especially for a flying thing. We usually associate birds with having pretty keen eyesight.
Right. Right.
That's true. That is
Yeah,
true.
Right, right. No, it's a wild description just to show up in the newspaper one day. So
Yes. Well, it actually was no coincidence that this monster showed up in Middletown in February of 1909, because in January of 1909, the Jersey Devil was having one of his episodes up in Jersey. It was January of 1909 was one of the periods of Jersey Devil sightings.
Well,
So
flaps,
if this was a Japanese film, they would be fighting pretty soon.
Well, except that this creature, well, the Jersey Devil there were the sightings going on, and then all the newspapers started report, like the next thing you know, the Jersey Devil's being reported in Philadelphia. And then he dips into Delaware a little bit. Then there are some other sightings across PA, including one, and this was in, I think, Bedford County.
That's immediately north. It's getting dangerously close.
Oh, it's getting
Yes,
close.
yes.
You all down there, yeah.
Actually, in Franklin County, just like a week after the Jersey Devil sightings, the headline was that Jersey monster seen near Knepper Station. And that's in Franklin County,
Wow.
Mount Alto.
Yeah.
And the sighting was described as of a creature with a head like a crocodile, with a neck long as a giraffe, 6 legs. This one had 14 eyes, two of them in its tail. Its tail resembled an old-fashioned umbrella. It had a mustache on its tail and a mustache on its nose.
Very proper.
These are very fanciful monsters that are evolving here. Its ears look like a hoop skirt, and it was wearing some links of sausage around its neck.
To ward something off, I'm assuming.
Yes. I don't know.
I have a question, because I mean, having read and recorded many old newspapers, this is very much in that line of certainly no one's really buying. Now, do you get any sort of impression what the intention behind the writing of this was? This just for fun? There was any follow-up articles or letters into the paper? Because I mean, we recently were talking about the weird footprints that were in I forget where, I think Wessex or Essex, England, or whatever. There was a series of correspondences into the newspaper that were published where some people were taking it very seriously, some people were taking it as a joke, some people more skeptical and more scientifically determined to find a solution to the problem. Was there any sort of follow-up that you were able to find where people believe this, or were people just having a laugh at this? Like, you had me at 14 eyes, but when it had 2 mustaches?
Yes. Yeah, that's where I draw the line. As far as that article, I'm not sure, But if after this, once this is still being called the Jersey Devil,
So
basically
okay,
being referred
okay.
to as the monster from New Jersey. And once this monster kind of crosses the Mason-Dixon line, things kind of, which is where we are, here as far as our Middletown Valley Register, they kind of take a turn because the article that I was reading from, describing the creature, the flying monster with one eye in the middle of his forehead, as described in the Middletown Valley Register, the headline, and this is on the front page of the Middletown Valley Register, the headline for this article was "The colored people are in great danger." And it says the subheadline is "Attacks Only Colored Men."
What?
And that was
So it sounds like their motivation was to drive people out, perhaps.
yeah, I think, there was, you can kind of track, the stories in the newspapers as, different newspapers and editors are getting hold
Yeah.
of the New Jersey Devil thing and having fun with it.
Yeah.
And once it gets below the Mason-Dixon line, the fun takes a little bit of a turn.
Yeah.
And it actually says that I'm going to switch to, of course, they're using the term colored over and over
Right.
again. But I'll switch to black. It
Mhm.
says a black man was a victim of this so-called go devil, or whatever it may be called.
Mhm.
That was something that they were calling the Jersey Devil.
Oh.
And it says that he was walking along a country road when it swooped down upon him, carried him to the top of a high hill, pierced his jugular vein with its needle-like bill, slowly sucked his blood while it gently fanned him with its wings. So
That's wild.
yeah. So
Oh my gosh.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a
So,
pretty colorful description of things
Wow.
going on.
yeah, we're getting graphic. We're getting graphic
Yeah.
here in Maryland.
So yeah, it definitely seems to be a warning or like
Right.
something like that to discourage residents.
Yes, and there's actually, when I started researching the Snallygaster lore, I found that there is a book written by a local guy named Patrick Boyton. It was called the Snallygaster, the Lost Legend of Frederick County. And he actually makes the connection between this, obvious like racism and it sounds like, it's trying to scare black people.
Mhm. Trying to intimidate people. Yeah.
Yes. So and he makes this connection in 1909. There was an amendment called the Strauss Amendment, which was going to be voted on, and that amendment would restrict voting rights of black men. It was kind of like some Jim Crow kind of esque stuff. And actually, this very same week, this article appeared, was the founding and kind of the first meeting of the NAACP. So there was definitely some stuff, afoot that had racist people,
Yeah,
right.
stirred
It was
up.
not just, there was no coincidence in the timing of those two events coming
Right.
up.
Right.
Right.
But that's a really interesting utilization of kind of the folk process there,
Mhm.
because the Jersey Devil has always been one of those sticky ones for me, because again, we can point to its creation. We can look at Ben Franklin and everything.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
The leads
it-
and yeah.
Right.
it's always one of those stories, much like, one of my big thing is man-made lakes with lake monsters in them, and so the
Mhm.
Jersey Devil is like one of those things to me. But that is that's a really, it sounds weird to say that's a really interesting take on it, because like this is
Mhm.
some nefarious things happening that it's being used for, but that is
Right.
what it
Well-
is. It's very curious, because I mean, there's a part of me that wants to believe that people that harbor bad thoughts and kind of malicious thoughts
Hmm.
are not artful somehow,
Right,
you
right.
know?
Well, we do see in folklore at other times. Like this is like a different kind of term, but we do see, or there is precedent, I guess, for people using ghost stories or
Hmm.
Bigfoot stories or devil dogs or whatever to discourage people from going on to like private land
Right.
or to
Canoodle in
besmirch.
cars, like the
Yeah,
hook, the
Hmm.
classic
Yeah,
hook story.
right, yeah.
exactly.
So
Exactly.
so there is obviously precedent of people using folklore to discourage something that, behooves them but isn't
Hmm.
maybe good for someone
Hmm.
else. But I've never heard, like, again, maybe this is like Susan, maybe this is common knowledge to other
Hmm.
folks who are into Snallygaster lore, but like I'm kind of shocked that I've never heard of this utilization because that
Hmm.
seems to be over 100 years ago. Someone made that correlation, was just like same week,
Right.
like
Yes. Hmm.
it's
Yeah. I mean,
wild.
it was just like, take the Jersey Devil, but make him racist.
Right.
I mean, and it literally, the how the term Snallygaster came about
Yeah.
That was my
was,
next guess,
yes,
or question rather.
yeah. The Valley Register, the following week, it was published just once a week. And that week it published a letter from a man named T.C. Harbaugh, who was living in Ohio at the time, and he was writing from Ohio. His letter didn't reach the newspaper till after the Jersey Devil had already reached Maryland. The letter from T.C. Harbaugh, who was, by the way, from Middletown and good friends with the editor of the Valley Register.
I see
Um,
where this is going.
yeah, so he had sent a letter from Ohio dated February 9th, so like the week before, and his letter says a gigantic monster passed over this place last night about 6 o'clock. It was plainly visible, had two immense bronze wings, an enormous head from which horn-like objects protruded, and a tail 20 feet long. It emitted a noise like the screech of an octololopus. Some who saw it declared it to be a snallygaster.
Oh my
The
gosh.
monster was moving toward Maryland.
Wow.
So that is where the name snallygaster, was first used, and it wasn't saying that this is the snallygaster. It was like
Yeah.
a snallygaster as a
Like,
type
Right.
of monster,
right. So
like
I
an octololopus
like,
or
oh, whatever
Whatever
that
that
is.
is.
a
Yeah.
made-up monster. Yeah.
Right. So I wonder, like, does that then tell us that Snallygaster was a known term other places, or do we think that was just made up of whole
I
cloth?
don't get the impression that it was, unless it's like a very regionally specific
That's what I was
thing.
wondering.
It was. There was a
Oh.
term snollygoster,
Mm,
which was a political term for like a kind of like a charlatan or kind of know-it-all politician.
really?
It's kind of a derogatory term.
Interesting.
Yes. So it was actually, I think it was first used like in the 1840s. And it was not uncommon, like kind of in the South or kind of this in kind of Maryland,
Really?
you
Oh,
would
that's
say it
fascinating.
here. Yeah.
I've never heard that in
Hmm.
that context. So
Yeah. So I think, that seems to be where that.
so a reader at the time would have heard that and been like, "Oh, just like Pete down the road, that Snallygaster,
Yeah,
or whatever."
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's
Like,
interesting because I recently was rereading through the classic book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, which is a
oh,
historian going
right.
through. And he
Mhm.
talks about this period, this specific
Hmm.
period,
Hmm.
1880 to like 19, we're really to like World War One, is being like the nadir of racial relations in very many ways.
Hmm.
And that's just that coincides with some of the other things I read in that book about that period in time. But boy,
Mhm.
again, just a very interesting utilization of folklore. And I'm still just bewildered by the garland of sausages.
I
That's
can't get past that. That was a great touch. I mean, I thought that it was a
right.
very great
I
touch.
mean, yeah,
Yes,
like give them points for creativity. Like that we can't.
exactly.
I mean,
Hmm.
you can't
This is
argue
what
with
I'm
that, I
saying.
guess.
Like, I would like to think these are brutish people that would harbor such thoughts, but even people who are opposed to can have be artful at times. Garlands of
Yes.
sausages, for
Garlands of
example.
sausage.
Well, the Garland of Sausages editors were that was the Franklin County newspaper.
Oh, okay.
So,
Well,
but yes,
not
there
that far
were,
removed,
yeah, there
unfortunately.
no, well, there were some, but there were, some colorful and charming details in the story, and that's why, that's how it's like caught people's attention,
Right.
so much, because in 1932
Hmm.
the Snallygaster made a
I
reappearance.
was gonna ask. Okay,
Yes.
interesting. Okay, so
And
we have more.
in that intervening time, I haven't been able to find any reference to the Snallygaster being referred to by the name Snallygaster
Hmm.
anywhere. But in 1932, the Middletown Valley Register brought back the Snallygaster. And this time, 1932, of course, was like the end of Prohibition. The Valley Register published the Snallygaster, after making his appearance. A strange monster mystifies and alarms person living in South Mountain. Believed to be the dreaded Snallygaster, which appeared in this section 23 years ago. Will not harm white persons, but lives mainly on colored men. Yeah. So,
Again. Oh my
again,
gosh.
same newspaper says Snallygaster's back, but in this
Ugh.
in this case, the Snallygaster meets its demise in a very fitting way. It is trying to drink from a vat of moonshine, and it falls into the moonshine, and some prohibition agents show up and they blow up the still with the Snallygaster in it. And the Valley Register actually publishes on its front page like this great photo of like the prohibition agent and local sheriff,
Uh-huh.
and like this kind of graphic that kind of looks like a monster in the sky. And all of that is kind of like charming, really.
Right.
If you can,
If
if you don't know or overlook the lives mainly on colored men stuff.
yeah, I've
Um,
never. Okay.
yeah. So a lot of people who today know about the Snallygaster and the legend of the
Hmm.
Snallygaster, don't know.
Don't recognize that part of the history and the folklore that
Right,
it's
right.
okay. So,
Yeah. So
wow.
when I was researching this, I asked someone, historical society in the Middletown area, and about this. Why were they trying to scare black people with the Snallygaster? And he said, oh, it wasn't that they were trying to scare black people. It was because of the national road was becoming more and more traveled. There were now a lot of cars. What the national road, goes right through Middletown, and
Yeah.
they were trying to scare like riffraff, from hanging around their area, but
Really?
like, but
Wow.
but
Okay.
but like hobos and
Yeah.
I don't know, traveling salesmen, I don't know, but it literally says colored men. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah. Like
so
that's very different than like
yeah, I mean, it literally says it.
then yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and to kind of sort of prove, I have searched and searched to try and find like any history of this there being a flying creature in this area, because I was like originally told, by local historians
Yeah.
that this was a legend that had come with the Pennsylvania Dutch when they settled in this area.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and then there was at some point Leo Spitzer, who's like a professor, linguist kind of guy. He actually wrote a paper on the name Snallygaster and like connected it to meaning Creek spirit, and there was a lot of stuff where like sort of retrofitted to the stories to kind of made it more palatable. And like when I first heard it, I mean, I repeated some of this stuff, when I was originally writing about the Snallygaster, that this was, that there were stories about a flying dragon that had been brought by the Pennsylvania Dutch when they settled in this area, because that was what, local historians had told me, and it's, written, but there, I can't find any evidence that that's actually true.
Wow.
It sounds like somebody's trying to soften the edges of a sharp story another way, because when you first brought the name up, I thought Geist, something like that. And while I don't speak Pennsylvania Deutsch, however, I could see how. There was some movie, I think it was My Big Fat Greek Wedding or something like that, and the one Greek man's always trying to really convert any word to show its Greek origin, and some of them are very reaching. That's kind of what I'm pulling from that.
Yeah, I think so. And like literally when this, first came up, it was a Snallygaster, but it was the Jersey Devil.
Right. So you're kind of conflating those a bit.
Yes, I mean they literally said that, this is the Jersey Devil, has made its way into Maryland, and then this, paper started calling it the Snallygaster. And the gentleman T.C. Harbaugh, who wrote that letter where he called it the Snallygaster, saying it's a Snallygaster.
Right.
He was a writer, and he wrote dime novels a lot. Yes, he was very imaginative, and he wrote lots of colorful, novels.
Wow.
So, I mean, it was all, very obviously made up. And in 1932, the connection to the political kind of connection, it was 10 days after FDR was elected that the Snallygaster returned. The Middletown Valley Register were like pro-temperance, and they didn't want prohibition to end. And there was even something in one of the Snallygaster articles that the Valley Register published about the return of the Snallygaster, saying that the Snallygaster's return is an omen of ill for colored voters.
Jeez.
So yeah, it's very blatant connection.
Now, is there any maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but do we see the Snallygaster showing up in this paper and other similar papers later in history, like around the civil rights movement, or in the 90s, or like?
The Valley Register wasn't in publication by then.
I wonder why. What a loss for.
Yeah,
but like, yeah,
no.
Okay, I was just
like quote unquote Snallygasters. I mean,
yeah.
You know how lots of times, there's like literally like Bigfoot type, sighting, but they'll call, if it's a monster, they'll call it the Snallygaster, like this, or it's
if it's just a general, for that purpose.
Yeah, there's nah.
So are there the research you've done? like so you haven't been able to find, or are there any like quote unquote like I don't want to say legitimate Snallygaster sightings because that sounds like a weird thing to say
Hmm.
now, but instances where a person unconnected with a newspaper
Right.
or a political group or whatever, there's not like Snallygaster sightings like there are and were Jersey Devil quote unquote sightings. If we're
No,
using that as a
no.
comparison, you know.
Right. Right. No, I mean, there might be people, who have seen like, kind of
Yeah,
like big flying creatures that they weren't sure what it
whatever.
was.
Yeah.
But another way that, I think is kind of proven that these stories didn't exist before, these Jersey Devil
Hmm.
sightings of 1909 when the Snallygaster originally made its appearance in Maryland, is that Madeline Dahlgren in her book,
Hmm.
With All the Legends and Lore, never mentioned anything about a Snallygaster
And
or a large flying dragon. Or
and it sounds like with Madeline Dahlgren, if that would have been an established thing, she
Mhm.
surely would have mentioned it. It sounds
She
like.
would have. She would have.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
definitely. Definitely. So, yeah.
Well, so there's a long history of, geez, wild stuff going on in this area. Are there any other, like outside of the Snarly Yow and the Snallygaster, is there anything else you've come across in the area that's either been like particularly interesting or there's anything else that's kind of caught your attention
Hmm.
as
Hmm.
either an analog to these or something completely different? Just kind of curious what else is prevalent
Right.
in the area.
One of the other like best known stories is that of the Dueo. And this originated in a newspaper. It was a newspaper story
Oh
in
wow.
1965.
Okay.
And supposedly a gentleman, I believe his name is John Becker, living on the outskirts of Gambrel State Park, had said that this big, kind of upright walking dog creature had kind of appeared on his property and that he had gotten into a fist fight with it. And Mr. Beck told the paper that this creature was a quote unquote dwayyo. The newspaper spelled it Dwayyo. So,
Wow.
um,
Okay.
so, and it published a drawing, kind of an artist rendering of this, and it looked basically like kind of werewolfy looking or like a upright
Yeah.
walking wolf. So to this day, no one's quite sure where this story originated. Nobody
Hmm.
was able to find this actual person
Hmm.
with this name, but it was like a big thing, like for a month in Frederick County with articles about the Dwayyo. At one point, there was a Dwayyo hunt planned.
Oh wow.
And like
Okay.
100 people signed up to go on this Dwayyo hunt, but then like nobody really showed up. um, and there were people like there were articles published that said, Mr. So and so, saw a dwyer running across his property, and what they describe sounds like a coyote, or like a large bird,
Something else
as
wholly
yes,
unremarkable.
yes, totally
Right.
different, totally different, just like how names of monsters get
Just
moved around.
repurposed. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, and the good thing about it is, I haven't been able to find any racist kind of connection to it, so that's good. The creature that this person who may or may not have existed, the creature that he described sounded kind of like a dog, what we would call a dog man
Right.
today. Um,
Right.
and I think the newspaper claimed that this story had come across their wires, however, like teletype or whatever they had in 1965 from the police department. that was who had originally received the call about the Dwayyo from Mr. Becker, telling about having
Mm-hmm.
fought this creature on his property. But oddly, like there have been in kind of that same vicinity over the years, some reports of kind of weird creatures that do sound kind of similar.
Right. Same vein, at
Mhm.
least. Yeah.
There's one that's kind of repeated in a number of places. Happened like I think in the 90s, where a young woman reported driving down a dark road at night close to this area, and this large upright walking dog creature
Okay.
started kind of pacing her vehicle.
Right.
And it had, it just looked very evil and menacing and had, drool coming down its mouth and like big fangs and, kept up with her car no matter how fast, she was
Mm-hmm.
going on this dark road. And, she was just terrified by it.
Wow.
And recently, I actually talked to a guy who reported seeing something similar in I think it was 2009.
Okay. So relatively
Mhm.
recently. Okay.
A little over 10 years ago. Okay, so 2014
Okay.
was
Yeah.
when he said it happened. And this was an area in Frederick County that's very close to the same area. And I actually went out and like drove around this area because
Okay.
it's not actually far from where I am right now. It's probably this was probably about 12 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of country and a lot of,
Right.
wooded, unpopulated space. And I
Mm-hmm.
had no idea this area was out there. And it is very remote and
Mm-hmm.
isolated. But this guy said that he was in high school at the time, and he and his girlfriend were looking for a place to park, and they went, further out, than they had ever been before because they kept getting caught at other places.
Right.
Um, and they saw, he described it as lanky. It walked funny on bony hind legs, and its, in quotation marks, arms were carried like a dog that was standing. The fur seemed
Mm,
matted and black, and the head
really.
was unnatural, somewhere
Uh,
between a dog and a primate. It was moving away from us, but briefly turned to look over its shoulder, which was bony. Its eyes burned red in the reflection of the headlights. And he said that we got the F out of there as fast as we could and never went back. Um, uh,
wow.
so, and in between, kind of when the Dwyer was originally seen, and like,
Yeah.
say 2014, there
Hmm.
like a lot of like random sightings of like strange kind of creatures.
Well, the dog. Like again, I'm one of those people who I don't love the term dog man necessarily for these
Hmm.
things, but just because
What's good?
that's what's kind of in the
Hmm.
popular culture right now.
Right, right.
Like these upright walking canines.
Uh-huh.
Um, that seems to be that seems to be kind of like the line through a lot of these things from
Hmm.
the snarly yow up to this gentleman's
Uh-huh.
sighting.
But
Hmm.
is that because that's an animal that, because they don't sound like dogs, but it's just an
They
animal
don't.
that we're so
Yeah.
much more familiar with. Like, if you were never in the woods and you came across a porcupine, it would kind of throw you off your game, or you came more
Right, for
likely like
sure.
across a mangy bear,
Oh yeah.
or
Hmm. Hmm.
it's or a coyote because they've been like kind of removed from the woods of
Hmm.
these regions until fairly recently in the
Hmm.
game.
Hmm.
Is it just us trying to wrap our head around? Like, imagine if you met an alien, like a bona fide alien. You could only describe it by comparing it to things you're
Right.
familiar with, which is, I think, the
Well,
classic trope of everything tasting like
hmm.
chicken.
Right. Well,
Right, right.
and the thing I think that's a little different with these, it seems like with these, these canine stories, is some of them sound like, natural animals, but everything from the snarly owl and this guy who tried to fight a snarly owl, maybe, which in one of your previous stories,
Uh-huh. Mhm.
which I think is pretty funny. Just
We have
because
two people. We have the guy who tried to fight the snarly owl on the National Road back in the
yeah,
1800s, and then this guy George Becker who tried to fight the
yes,
owl,
the way out, yes,
or
thank you,
did
yes,
yes,
did
gotten
fight, did tried
yes.
to at least, and it's like, so I do think it's funny that that's like a bit of a trope for these folks too. It's like,
Yeah.
well, like, yeah, well, like if you see it, people's first question, like, well, did you swing at it? Like, did you
Right.
try and,
The Marylanders' first reaction.
Right,
They're right.
Apparently.
yeah, swing first,
Sorry.
Maryland. That's what, yeah, exactly.
There you go.
Fighting Frederick County, but
New motto.
right, but it sounds like some of these stories do have a like definite paranormal bend with them not being
Mhm.
able to, or like you mentioned, the story about the person who had the thing running next to their car.
Mhm,
Like
mhm.
you hear that in all kinds of like high strange stories about things running along the side of cars
Right, right.
at unnatural speeds. There's
Mhm.
definitely some natural elements. There's definitely some supernatural elements to these stories. Nick, because Susan mentioned the red glowing eyes, I get to talk about Tapetum lucidums again. So if people are playing Ghost Furnace Bingo, that one gets marked.
Nice.
But again, that's something that could be associated with a natural creature or not.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
I've not even bothered to learn that word because I just think
That's
you
fine
gotta
as long as
have it
one
for
of us
yourself.
knows it. But
Keep it alive.
right, but so I mean, these stories are pretty wild, especially that last one with that gentleman who you spoke to. Now, is there like, because you said you worked with Lauren Coleman earlier and everything, like is there like a documented history of like specifically these upright canines? Like this seems like this is a large concentration of those stories. Is that anomalous in your experience, or is this just kind of like the lens that we're taking to it right now?
I don't know. I mean, I know that there, yeah, I mean, obviously I'm sure you guys, there are certain areas, that are, the Bray Road kind of thing, areas that are famous
Right.
for that sort of thing. But,
Hmm.
this area, I don't think, is known for that. And I think,
More than
like even people who are into Bigfoot and that sort of thing, I don't think, are really aware, of kind of this through line of menacing
hmm.
ghost dogs and cryptid like, actual animals
Right.
that, in modern
Hmm.
day are still, people are still seeing, believe they're seeing something,
Right.
out there.
Right. It's interesting that you say it like that, because I think that is like maybe one of the pun intended missing links here with some of these stories, is that like the difference between someone seeing a Bigfoot and Bigfoot researchers being real keyed
Hmm.
into like
Hmm.
that versus like an obvious ghost dog story, like with some of these, or especially early Snarly Owl ones. Like in my mind, from a folklore and storytelling standpoint, like those things are much closer in origin probably than they are different,
Hmm. Hmm.
so like I think I personally think we should be looking at all those, like, yeah, we can get granular with stuff, but like that you would hope that would be just as interesting to a bit quote unquote Bigfoot researcher as it would be
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
someone who's collecting ghost dog stories,
Hmm.
but that's fascinating. So like it sounds like there's a lot going on in this area. So
Does.
uh I'm really curious to kind of dig into more of this in the future, in some
Yeah.
of our research and everything. But one of the things I do want to ask you, because doing all this work in this area, have you seen anything or run into anything in this area that you can't explain? Do you have any experiences you're comfortable showing? And not to put you on the spot too
Mhm.
much, but
Oh, sorry.
but I've just been wondering. I'm like, oh, if she's out
Mhm.
there driving around looking for this stuff, like maybe she's seen something, you know?
Yes, well, I'm definitely not driving around at night looking for
Right.
things.
You've
I
learned, right?
mean,
Yeah.
maybe that's what I need to do. But no, I haven't run into any of these creatures myself.
Okay.
I would love to see a ghost dog. I'm not sure if I'm really up for seeing like a werewolf
Yeah, there's
kind
definitely
of thing.
there's definitely a spectrum of like,
Yeah.
um yeah, seeing a ghost dog on the road in the evening, as it just kind of passes, it's like, okay, that's not too bad. But a 9 foot tall snarly owl running next to your
Yeah.
car at 60 miles an hour, not quite as inviting.
No.
Um
But no, I wish I have, but
yeah.
so
No,
far
that's
from here.
I had to ask. And so the one last thing I want to ask about from a folkloric standpoint, just because we mentioned it a few times tonight, and we talk about roads so much on this show, and a lot of these you've mentioned this national road. Like we have a few major, like historically important highways here
Hmm.
in Pennsylvania.
Well, and the
So
national road runs through our
Right,
Pennsylvania too. It's Route 4.
right,
right,
yes, Route
Which
40
right.
I've been
here.
Hmm.
to the S Bridge
That's
down
what
in
here's.
Washington
Yep.
County. Very cool.
Yeah, it
Yes.
is super cool. So like do you think that road itself, just the fact that so many people travel on it and it's going through these towns,
Hmm. Hmm.
do you think that like plays into, I mean, it definitely plays into some of the origin, it sounds like, with how people were utilizing the newspapers and everything with the folklore. But how do you see that road fitting in with either how the folklore started in some of these stories, or
Hmm.
why it still is so popular today?
Hmm. Well, I think, like that one gentleman, had mentioned that, a road bringing people from other places,
Right.
that, and people, were clearly then and still are now, suspicious of people from other places,
Right.
people who, they feel, don't belong. There's also, I think, like the element of, like a road can kind of be seen as like kind of a liminal space,
For sure.
in
Yeah.
between places, and
Hmm.
which tends to be a place where interesting or mysterious things can happen. Um, and it seems like there are a lot of sightings of weird things, like when you
Hmm.
hear like how many, I don't know what percentage, but a lot of Bigfoot sightings are like, yeah, I was driving along, such and such a place that, and,
Right.
people see all sorts of, creatures or unexplained things, or, ghosts. There are a lot of ghosts that are seen, supposedly along roadways and all.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, we haven't even touched on the ghost stories
you're
in this
right.
area, I'm sure. So there's
No, we haven't.
yeah, so there's a lot. So wow, that's, I mean, and I don't know, it's funny. I feel like whenever we first started talking about doing this
Mhm,
episode
mhm.
tonight, Susan, like you were the one who mentioned Western Maryland specifically as compared to just the whole state, obviously.
Right.
And I think this is such a fantastic example about how whenever you dig down in an area and look at these specific areas and how the folklore affects the culture and vice versa, and how the people and the history and the stories they're all like tied together.
Mhm,
um like digging down really does make a difference, and it's
mhm.
usually tells us a lot more than taking a 10,000 foot view. And I
Right.
think this is a fantastic example of that. So
Yes, definitely. I mean, that's where stories like this just get more and more interesting,
mhm.
the more you learn, even though it may be quote unquote debunking, a paranormal aspect, but it still just gets more and more fascinating
Right.
and
I agree because
telling.
again, digging deeper, you find more of these deeper and
Hmm.
somewhat upsetting origins of Snallygasters,
Right.
and that's much more important than just the
Right.
Hmm.
surface view. I agree.
Yep, and it's a reflection of what's going on,
Mhm.
in the area at that time, and it's a way to, sort of, you
Well,
know, see what it was like, for different, people in the community.
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point, and it's a good snapshot of a time and a place and how people were feeling, and that's true no matter what the subject of the story, And like something we talked about recently was the drone flap in New Jersey
Right.
a few months ago. 100 years from now, people are going to be talking about, well, hopefully people will be talking about, that the folklore around that flap
Hmm.
and what it tells those people about how we felt about, airspace safety and government
Hmm.
oversight and other.
Right.
So I mean, like, like,
Hmm.
like, like we're all like, no one is free from that lens from the
Right.
future, But I think that whenever you find stuff like this, like again, before tonight, every time I had heard the word Snallygaster, I just thought that's a funny name.
Yeah, I
What a
mean,
fun
it's a
story
fun
must be.
story. Yes.
Right. Yeah. And it's so I mean, one, it's just it's good to get some context around that and learn that again, like a lot of things, like you mentioned, Nick, there's usually a lot more going on to these things,
Mhm.
both good, bad, ugly, and different, that it's important to talk about. So,
Right.
I mean, thank you for doing the work that you do, Susan, to talk about these things
Oh,
and
sure.
make sure
Thank
that
you for
they're
inviting me to
no, absolutely.
discuss it. I like hearing, your guys' perspective on these sorts of things
Well,
too.
thank you. Well, we really enjoy learning about things, so
I can tell.
that's right. So that's kind of I think what keeps us going here. But I mean, I'm sure this is not the last time you're going to be on this show talking to everyone, because like we mentioned
Thank
earlier,
you.
you are a published author. You did mention the Maryland Spells book that was I think from what 2023. That one's relatively new, isn't it?
Yes, and that was when kind of during the pandemic, I was kind of
Okay.
experimenting with doing the Amazon publishing
Oh,
thing.
okay.
So it was
Yeah.
so I would say it's it worked out better than I thought, but it's not. I'm not particularly good at the
Uh,
laying it out and all that. Yeah.
that's a whole art to
The whole
itself. It
technical,
really
but
is.
yeah,
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 it really
yeah.
is. I've heard that from a few authors who have done kind
Uh-huh.
of some of the self-publishing stuff, and it's
Uh-huh.
uh
Yeah, but it was kind of fun because that was the first time I'd done, a self-publishing thing, and
right.
it gives you some freedom.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, for sure. And we did talk a little bit earlier about the American Witches Broomstick
Mhm.
tour through 4 centuries.
Mhm.
The one of the books that I have of yours that I really enjoyed. I really would like to have you back on sometime to talk about that book because I think it's
That
also
would be
really important.
fantastic.
So
Yay.
again, not the last time, but we'll go ahead and we'll kind of wrap this up for tonight. So if anyone out there has any questions for Susan or wants to find her books, Susan, where's the best place for people to find your books if they're curious?
Well, if you can get it through your local independent bookseller, lots of times they can order,
Mm-hmm.
special order something for you. That's always ideal. But you can also get them on Amazon and use copies, floating
Mm-hmm.
around and all too. So, but yeah, all the usual places.
Okay, cool. I'll make sure the names and everything are in our description for the show notes for this episode.
Thanks.
Um, so yeah, so if anyone out there has anything they want us to pass on to Susan or any questions for us, you can always find us at the Ghost Furnace Podcast on Instagram and YouTube, or you can send us an email at the ghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com. So again, thank you so much, Susan. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your having me. It's so fun to talk to you.